And I'd like to introduce to you Mads Nipper, the CEO of Ørsted tonight. You have an agenda.
I do.
You do have an agenda, fighting climate change. And thank you for coming here tonight and giving your take on climate change and what business's responsibility is in this fight. And we have agreed, or you have agreed, to taking questions actually.
Absolutely.
The idea is that you're going to talk for about 15 minutes and we're going to have time for a few questions that you can ask using the chat function of Zoom. Mads?
Thank you so much, and thanks a lot for the invitation. It's always nice to be invited out. Admittedly would have been a little bit nicer if there were more people in the room, but at least we have the opportunity to interact, hopefully also with a few questions. And I'm happy to hear you have both the awards and the wine tasting afterwards. It's always nice to be invited, and especially if I'm invited to talk about something which is very dear to my heart and to the heart of the company I work for, which is climate change. I hope it has not missed the attention of any of the participants of the call that climate change is the largest single threat to humanity and the life as we know it. And it sounds dramatic, but it is. And I think the number of climate deniers has actually gone radically down because just this year we've had the IPCC report saying that there is no doubt that climate change not will happen, but is happening. There is no doubt that it is human or man-made. And there is no doubt that there is an urgency to do something about it. I actually don't think I need to talk much more about the fact that climate change is something we already see. Just look at the floodings, tragic floodings with many deaths we had in Central Europe this year. In Southern Europe, over the last relatively few years, an area sort of close to the size of Denmark, it has converted into desert because of drought. We see increasingly violent storms. We see many cities being dug up because they are being prepared for extreme rainfall or even flooding. And we see the monsoon in Southeast Asia. We see droughts in California, China, so on and so forth. So this is not something that we are only going to talk to our children and grandchildren about if we are to explain what on earth have we been doing for the past 30 or 50 years, letting those emissions get out of control. It is something for our lifetime as well. Is this just something for the politicians? Because obviously they're the ones who primarily meet at COP26 and in the United Nations Climate Week. Yes, it is to a very large extent the responsibility of politicians. They're the ones who set the national determined contributions. They're the ones who need to make the policy framework. They need to make significant investments in decarbonizing their energy systems and also to ensure that the policy frameworks, the tax system and so on support the right behavior. But we as businesses, we not only can, we should be doing a lot. And that sounds like a negative thing, we have to. And yes, the answer is we also have to. Out of sheer obligation as somebody who acts in society, like we don't take bribery, we don't use child labor. Now we soon, very soon, if not already, have to say we don't conduct our business in a way that leaves behind sort of a greenhouse gas emission higher than it absolutely needs to be. So if I should point to some very tangible reasons why fighting climate change is fundamentally a good idea for business, they would be, amongst them would be some of the following. If you start with a slightly negative or defensive angle, you are at a huge risk of not having a business if you don't take proactive action on fighting climate change. Because there will be things like a carbon tax, there will be things like a regulatory sort of pressure on saying if you don't do this, you're not allowed to do your business. There will be customers who will say, we simply don't want to do business with you. I can say that for Ørsted, for example, where we have a sort of very ambitious decarbonization program of our supply chain, if our suppliers don't use green power by 2025, we will question whether we should do business with them. Likewise, there will be consumers who will say, if you cannot prove to me you have a lower footprint of your products, we won't buy your product. So there is a real risk that not only will you be paying real money to fight the combined impacts of climate change that is happening, because you need to sort of prove your buildings, you need to do risk management, but if you don't take action, either because of laws, because of taxes, or because of consumer reaction, you could find yourself out of business in a relatively limited number of years. But it's not just bad and a threat that is hanging over our heads. On the contrary, there are many opportunities. Just look at what branding impact you can gain if you say, I'm a front runner in my industry. Just look at the consumer position you can have if you can say, I'm actually now giving you a product where you with a better consciousness can eat, whether it is meat, buy power, buy cars with green steel, whatever have you. And if you take that one step further, you can even say you can create entirely new markets. Like the transformation for the company I'm privileged to work for, Ørsted, we went from being a sort of a financially not very healthy fossil fuels energy company. And by the previous leadership, the courageous decision of saying we want to transform our business to be a renewables business is something that has sort of really multiplied the total value of the company, made much greater business expansion, and essentially created a market for offshore wind. Yes, it was there, but the ones to prove that it was there at scale was Ørsted. Now look at what is happening with a company like Maersk, because you could say, if you were the management of Maersk, you would say, oh, we burn 12.5 million tons of crude oil every year for our fleet of ships. Huge threat. We are one of the biggest polluters in the world. This is a massive threat to the existence of our business. But instead of just saying, how can we limit the damage, the company, like in there, now the same thing with Ørsted said, how can we turn it into an opportunity and create a market that doesn't exist for green logistics? Likewise, Tesla has created a market at scale for electric vehicles. But I would claim that it's not just the Ørsteds, the Maersks and Teslas of the world. Every single company, big and small, can create new business opportunities, can create new markets by actually creating a product or a service that actually addresses the need and the consumer and customer willingness to pay pay more or buy more because you have the right product. Because if you're a first mover, you will have an advantage on a trend that I guarantee you will not just come, it will accelerate. But let me also turn to investors, because if you fundamentally are decarbonizing your value chain, if you have a net zero pledge, if you are taking real actions, not just in words, but in action as well, you can actually not only attract more investments, because I can tell you that the ability to attract investors for a company that is fundamentally sustainable, not least on climate action, is substantially larger than, if, for example, if you are an oil major whose business is fundamentally unhealthy or wrong. So the investor interest is much higher. Likewise, there's a market now for green funding. I mean, we issue green bonds. We actually have some of our lending facilities directly linked to our own emissions. So the lower our emissions, the lower our interest rates. And these are products that more and more banks and financial institutions will be offering. So also from investors and financial institutions, there's going to be a huge sentiment and incentive, and likewise, if you don't take action, disincentive to actually to work. And then I'll mention also that if you don't take action, or almost as bad, if you say you take action but have no substance in it, or only do the storytelling, there will be, I typically say sort of teasingly in a kind way, there will be the Greta Thunbergs of the world who will smoke you out. If you cannot document what you do, you're ultimately going to end up being in trouble. So what can you do to limit the risks? What can you do to ensure that you tap into new markets? What can you do to ensure that you also sort of get access to all the benefits that will be by being a front runner on climate actions? I'll say, and this sounds sort of almost too self-righteous, but the first thing you can do is to look yourself in the mirror and saying, am I taking my share? Are we taking in our company our share of the responsibility? And I actually think And in many cases, the North Star of business leaders should be to say, what would the world miss if we were no longer around? So if your business didn't exist, would it only be profit for the shareholders that it would be missing? Or would it be somebody that proved that a different way, a different path was possible going forward in terms of addressing some of the world's biggest challenges, not least climate, could also be water, social injustice, biodiversity, and other sustainability impacts. But you can also choose to take fundamental actions in the ecosystems that you're part of. Try to convince your partners, your suppliers, put requirements to your suppliers. That's what we do. And that's what I hope more and more companies will do, so that it becomes painfully obvious that in order to stay in business and have a thriving business, you need to decarbonize. What you can also do very tangibly is you can commit to a sort of a very specific plan, a science-based plan. Actually, Science-Based Target Initiative, we are at Ørsted, we are privileged to be one of only 7 companies in the world that now have our full decarbonization plan science approved. But there will be many, many more. And before we know it, there will be people who are saying, if you don't have a science-based decarbonization plan, why should we do business with you? Now, I am convinced that this path does not have to be as difficult as we think it is. I'm convinced that there are opportunities for all companies, big and small. As a matter of fact, I was in Vejle Music Theatre, having in the local sort of business union, there were several hundred people, and I was at Grundfos at the time, and they said, yeah, that's easy for you to say, because that is your business, but I run a carpentry with 50 people here, what can I do? I think, so what have you done in electrifying your vehicles? What have you done with your suppliers? What have you done to minimize your waste of products? What have you done to optimize your logistics so you don't burn more or drive more kilometers than you have to? And the thing is, he realized at the time that by being more sustainable, he could actually save costs as well. And that is where I think every business leader should go to say, maybe I can create new markets, maybe there's new business, maybe I can save costs, so that even if you don't care about what you tell your grandchildren about, whether you actually ran a business that you'd be proud to tell your children and grandchildren about, even if you only care about the financials, fact is, you are likely going to be convinced that the right thing to do is actually to take climate action. And as a matter of fact, there is a study amongst some of the world's biggest companies that those who do have strong ESG, so environment, social and governance performance, they on average have a return on investment or a return on equity that is 40 to 60 times higher than those who don't. So even for those of you who only are commercial, it's a fundamentally good thing to do. And I think I'll leave it with that, even though I could talk about this topic for much longer. But I'd much rather, if anybody would have a question, please type it in chat, and then we'll take it from there.
Thank you very much, Matt, for giving us this case that you present as a business case. There is a business case in being green. Are there questions out there?
Otherwise, I'm sure you can kick off with one-liner.
If there are no questions there, yeah, well, maybe we can talk about the international situation.
Yes.
What you argued now, I think this will be listened to in Europe.
Yes.
With great understanding.
Yes.
But there are other parts of the world where it might not be that easy.
That's right.
South Asia.
Absolutely.
East Asia. How optimistic can we be that your reasoning will be listened to also in other parts of the world?
Yeah, I think there are certainly parts of the world where it's a lot more difficult, but it's possible everywhere. I'm convinced of that. And also, if you look at this, is a global trend. Every single country is facing the challenges right now, and even some of the world's largest emitters, like China and India, are taking action. They're taking structural action as well, not as much as they need to, which is why I hope they'll come back at next year's COP with even higher ambitions. But they are taking action. And these company leaders, they are smart people as well. And they will know that the Western part of the world will to an ever-increasing extent not be willing to do business with them. But we need to do what I call market creation. So for example, on wind farms, which is what we know well, if the regulators who buy those projects from people like Ørsted or Vattenfall or RWE, if all they care about is the lowest possible price, economic incentive is to also buy the lowest possible price components, which could be Chinese, that we transport over long distances that are made with coal fire. So I also think it's up to customer behavior, even if it's a country, to say, in order to win this, you have to have more sustainable solutions.
So the solution really comes from consumers and from businesses.
It does.
To a bigger extent than from government.
It also comes from government, because one of the most effective ways, if I could have one big wish for Christmas, which unfortunately I know I'm not going to have, it is a global carbon tax. Because that would create an immediate economic incentive for everybody to do the right thing. But of course, unfortunately, every single country, they are afraid of losing the jobs if the others don't take it. So if the international organization could, if they could agree on a global carbon tax, that would be the biggest breakthrough of humanity.
So I think we've broken the ice
We
here.
have.
There are lots of questions.
Yes.
Question of choosing.
Yes. Now I can take the first one where it's saying, how do you judge customers or partners' willingness to pay more for sustainable solutions? It's a fantastic question, because that is difficult. But there are multiple studies being made that actually show that if you look at, for example, a pair of sneakers, the additional price for that in order to be transported with totally green logistics is 10 or 20 cents. A car made fully of green steel is only a few $100s of additional price. And likewise, you can continue. So what the end consumer will buy is a ridiculously small amount. But if a car company, if they want to buy thousands of tons of steel, it sounds like a lot. But if you look at in average in Europe, on average we consume 300 kilograms of steel every year. That would be the equivalent of $30 if it was all green. Then we would decarbonize an entire sector, one of the biggest emitters. So we need to change, we need to ensure that we fundamentally change consumer behavior, because in business to business, Mark Meyer is right, it's difficult.
Yeah. And there might even be higher margins in green products.
There has to be, short term at least, because until it's there, there will be. I mean, if I could get my meat, for example, at a which was fundamentally more sustainable, I would be prepared to pay a premium. I know Maersk is prepared to pay a premium for green fuels rather than bunker oil, but ultimately the consumer, so the end consumer, needs to pay their price, but we need to have that trickle back into the value chain, so that it really gets out to the consumer.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are a few more questions. Maersk, where you have actually touched upon Maersk.
Yeah, so I can take the answer. What opportunities do you see for Ørsted in Germany in the coming years? I can only say huge opportunities. Yeah. Germany has one of the biggest needs to decarbonize in Europe. Germany just upped their ambition by 2030, green power from offshore energy from 20 to 30 gigawatts, and that's a lot. That's a lot, and that means that the opportunity both to build offshore, to build onshore, but also to help big German industrials. We, for example, just made a power purchase agreement with BASF, the world's largest chemical company. There's multiple opportunities, also in green hydrogen, which you can make from green power. So for those sectors where you cannot electrify, you can actually make green hydrogen or green fuels, and this is something where Germany is probably the single biggest opportunity in Europe for Ørsted.
Yeah, and for Denmark.
For Denmark in general.
At a whole. Yeah, I think we have 2 minutes left here. We want to take another one.
Yeah, I think I can take the last. You have seen an upcoming standard, so we can follow a framework to have a green calculation and do it in the same way. I think the best bet is the science-based targets. I know it's not sort of a very detailed standard, but one of my big concerns is that the world, and especially corporates, they will say, oh, it's easy for me to decarbonize. I can just buy offsets. Somebody plants a tree and then I'm off the hook. Mm-hmm. You need to do everything you can to actually reduce your emissions first, because that's the only way you can get science-based approved. And that's what's difficult, because I could go out tomorrow, any company in Denmark could go out tomorrow and buy offsets. Many of those offsets are unfortunately not real. And that means that the only tangible way you can really decarbonize, and that is what science-based targets will help you do, is to reduce, and then only offset the last parts and be damn sure you buy the right offsets that are actually substantial. So there is a framework, and I can only encourage everybody to look into SBTi or Science-Based Targets Initiative. It's the best we have, but I'm sure at a national level there will be frameworks as well.
Great.
Maybe as a final mention, we do not accelerate the amount of green energy. What's your take on this? What's Ørsted doing to accelerate the development? You're right. The world can only move too slow on having more green energy. But it's also important to say, and we of course have a commercial interest in that. So we will do everything we humanly possibly can. But it's also about really the biggest constraints right now is to make land and seabed available. In Denmark, we just had one of the large offshore projects, Hesselø, postponed because of sea conditions. The Omø project was postponed because of a frog that could be endangered. And full respect for that, we need to protect biodiversity. But if we don't find a way to speed up making land and seabed available, we won't be in time.
We can see that in Germany.
Yes.
We have to speed up the process.
We want a lot of wind turbines as long as they're not in our backyards.
We need Denmark's help.
Exactly.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mads Nipper, for an inspiring speech on sustainability and CO2 neutrality.